56-year-old Deborah Houchin doesn't know the meaning of downtime. After a draining divorce, she's full speed ahead on a new, exciting chapter in her life.
Deborah had been divorced about 5 or 6 years. She was a runner. She ate well, so perhaps that always was in the forefront for Deborah in terms of just putting her best foot forward.
Mary Grace! Deborah! Hey! You're out early. I thought you usually did night runs.
Yeah, well, you gotta get it in while you can.
Yeah, that's true. How are the kids?
Much better, much better. Good. And I've been meaning to thank you for the casserole you sent over. You don't know how much you saved me. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Deborah was a really warm and loving, caring person. She would go out of her way to help other people. Great person to have for a friend.
Okay, we gotta pick up the pace, Mary Grace. I gotta get to work. Come on, girl.
For the past 25 years, Deborah has worked as a successful social worker, sharing an office with her best friend, Amy Tinch.
Hey,
Hey,
how's it going?
good. How are you?
Deborah and I were absolutely two peas in a pod. Deborah was the person in the practice that made everything look pretty, and I was the businesswoman. So it was a great blend.
What's on your plate today?
A full roster of clients, and then I'll probably hit the trails later tonight. What about you?
About the same thing, minus that whole running part.
I'm going to get you out there one of these days. Mm-hmm. You'll love it. Oh,
You got mail?
yeah.
I'm gonna leave you to it.
Okay, talk to you later.
Okay.
Deborah's specialty was marriage counseling. Things didn't work out with her first husband, but she wasn't the type to give up to find love. And she moved on and started dating other people and got back out online.
Hello, Travis. Here goes.
As caring and compassionate as Deborah is with others, she hopes to one day find the same in a relationship. But it's never that simple.
Hi. Are you Travis?
Depends on who's asking.
I am so sorry. You look exactly like someone I'm supposed to meet. I'm sorry.
I'm just kidding. You must be Deborah.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Travis. Sit down.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you, too.
Finally.
Hi there. Welcome. Can I get you something to drink?
Yes.
She'll have what I'm having, sweetie.
Actually, I think I'll just have a glass of iced tea.
Okay.
Make mine a double, darling.
You got it.
Thank you.
When you're talking about online dating, you don't know who you're talking to. You know, it's a 21st century way of doing things. I get that. But to me, it's extremely dangerous. There are a lot of people out there who want to harm you, and it's scary.
No matter how many times Deborah may strike out in the dating world, she looks forward to spending weekends catching up with her friend Amy.
Sorry. Was it really that bad?
Let's just say I came directly home and took a shower.
Oh, no.
He was creepy.
Sorry.
Yeah. I'll survive.
You will survive.
Deborah was not desperate, but she did want a relationship. She wanted to have a family. She wanted to have a man in her life.
Thankfully,
Okay.
I do have another chance, though, and this one I'm excited about.
Well, tell me.
His name is Lester Winningham,
Okay.
and he is, hold on.
Right.
Deborah wanted somebody that was caring and loving and interested in family. And Les was a child psychologist. He was finishing up his graduate school in Wichita Falls.
Oh, okay. Oh, he's handsome.
Meeting somebody that was in her field on online dating, I thought that was really, really awesome.
Have you arranged a date yet?
Yes, we have.
You have?
Yes, we have.
Okay.
Tomorrow night.
Tomorrow night. Well, cheers
Oh, thank you.
to tomorrow night.
And Lester.
Has to be better than last night, right?
The following night, Deborah follows through on her plans. And Lester doesn't disappoint.
Well, here we are.
Yeah.
A marriage counselor and a soon-to-be child psychologist. You know, we're going to have to be careful we don't overanalyze one another.
It's true. So I'm just curious, what made you want to pursue your PhD at this?
At such an advanced age.
Well, no, that's not what I meant.
Yeah,
That's
it
what I
is.
meant,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. I don't know. Getting my license was always something I wanted to do. You know, it's, on my bucket list. So one day I just decided I'm going to do it. Age be damned.
Good for you.
So what about you? Did you always know you wanted to be a counselor?
No, not always. But when I got to college, I did.
You're cold.
I am. It's freezing in here.
Deborah loved strong, powerful men. Les was kind to Deborah, and definitely a very, very different man from the other men that Deb had dated.
In the days that follow, things heat up between Deborah and Lester. Fast.
No, you're not calling too much, actually. No, I love it. I think it's great.
Les was a friendly person. I thought they made a great couple. She was kind, he was kind. They were in the same profession. They both had the same heart. I honestly thought that they would be a perfect match for each other.
All right, it's a date. See you then. Bye.
After dating many guys, she was ready to settle down, to end that part of her being single.
Still, Deborah faces a few loose ends from her past dating life.
Oh, Travis. Yeah, not a chance. Deborah Houchin's office? Hello? Hello?
Deborah Houchin's office, huh? Pretty formal over there.
Travis?
Yeah. I just saw you deleted me, and here I was hoping we could go out again.
No, I certainly didn't mean to delete you. I'm still getting used to this dating website technology.
Obviously, a lot of these dating sites, everything turns out well, and people get married, which is great. But I do think there are people that they're wolves in sheep's clothing.
So, you up for another date?
You know what, Travis? I'm just gonna have to say no for right now. Okay, so you just take care. Okay, bye. Ugh.
After a late night at the office, 56-year-old Deborah Houchin arrives at her Texas home alone.
Oh, wait. Hey, Deb, sorry. Sorry, it's just me. You have a good night.
Carl, you too. Night runners.
Hey, babe. You okay?
No, I'm fine. How was class?
In a matter of weeks, Deborah and Lester Winningham go from meeting online to sharing everything.
I think that she had been lonely and wanted somebody to come in. Deb was, in her later 50s then, and maybe kind of thinking that time was getting short for her.
Only a few months into their relationship, the couple moves in together. And soon, Deborah even invites Lester to join her counseling practice.
Didn't even wake me up this morning before you left.
Well, I just didn't have the heart to wake you up.
You should have.
When Les joined the practice, I was very good with it. Their relationship was wonderful. Growing the business was obviously important to me, and Deborah paved the way for him to start a practice fully occupied with patients. I mean, that's unheard of.
Deborah's hours would usually be Monday through Thursday. She'd come in around noon, between 11 and noon, and she'd see till the evening, 6 or 7.
Well, that's about all the time we have. So unless you have something else?
Actually, there is one more thing.
Okay.
I think about you a lot. And these aren't nice thoughts, if you know what I mean.
Well, this is probably the first positive relationship that you've had in quite a while. So it's easy to confuse what's happening here.
No. This is different.
Transference is a situation where the patient can dissipate their emotions and feelings onto the therapist for things that they really have felt or experienced with other people. Part of our job is to be able to set really good boundaries with them.
Remember, you're paying me to help you. This is a professional arrangement, nothing more. Okay, I'll see you next week.
As the holidays approach, Deb takes Les to Seattle, where she looks forward to introducing the main man in her life to her sister, Marlene.
Merry Christmas to me and to you and to everybody.
Those look beautiful.
Yeah.
This is what I was telling you about.
Well, now I know where Deborah gets her shopping habit from.
Oh, yeah, it's genetic.
Guess there's no fighting it then?
No, there's not. We're very good. We're very good at it.
Well, I'll leave you two alone for a bit. I'm gonna grab a shower. Okay.
Come sit.
Actually, I'm gonna be more comfortable right here.
What?
Deborah Houchin,
Oh.
I loved you the moment you walked into that restaurant.
Gosh.
Will you marry me?
Yes.
You will.
Yes. Yes, I will marry you.
When she and I would travel together, Deb would invariably buy a bride's magazine in the airport. And she would say, Amy, I can't wait until the day that I get to be the bride and you are my maid of honor. She wasn't really involved with Les for very long because she probably met him in the summer or a little more prior. And then by Christmas time, Deborah was engaged.
I do love you, Mrs. Winningham.
I like the sound of that.
But while Deborah is wrapped up in the excitement of this new development, it does bring some concerns.
Is this what I think it is?
You have to wait till Christmas to find out. Oh, I'm so excited. Your ring is beautiful, Deb.
It is. Isn't it?
It is. Lester's a great guy. I really like him. But Don't you think this is going really fast? I mean, financially, you're in great shape.
Yeah.
Have you thought about getting a prenup?
Yeah, I guess it is a good idea. For the boys.
She had 2 stepsons that were children by another woman, but financially, she could take care of herself. She never tapped into any of the money that she had received from her divorce. And that was money, I believe it was my understanding, that she had intentions of leaving to those 2 stepsons.
As the holidays wind down, Deborah and Lester turn to all things wedding, which leaves Deborah highly aware that the time to talk about the prenup is now.
So, spring wedding? Summer? Either way, I think we need to set a date to Mr. and Mrs. Winningham.
First of all, spring. Definitely spring.
I knew it.
Second of all, there is something that I want to talk to you about.
Okay.
Given our ages and stages in life, I was thinking that,
What is it, Deb? You know you can tell me anything.
I know. Well, seeing as how retirement is right around the corner, I was thinking, well, what do you think about a prenup? I have put a lot of money away for the boys, and I want to make sure that... Lester, say something.
A prenup.
Yeah.
You want to start a brand new marriage on a prenup?
Lester,
you're going to go right into this marriage with distrust right off the bat?
Please. Stop.
Stop. You want me to stop? I'll tell you what, this marriage is off.
What?
It's done. You couldn't even pay me to marry you.
Deborah Houchin's wedding plans with Lester Winningham have come crashing down at her first mention of a prenup.
Deborah was very upset, not understanding why, if you love somebody, why a prenup would be a problem.
You should have seen him, Amy. He flew into a rage. He was a completely different man.
God, Deb, what'd you do?
I told him to pack his things and move out.
She told me she had given them the ring back and that they'd been cordial, but that was the way it was going to be. And so I just think that that was a deal breaker for her. She really did not want to let him have the money that she had worked hard for.
Look, okay. Wait, no, you're gonna be fine. And after that kind of an outburst, I mean, you don't need Lester Winningham. You can do better.
I know, you're right. He scared me. Oh, my God.
I'm so sorry.
I've got a client. Thank you.
I'm here if you need me.
Thank you.
Though Deborah's decision is clear, the breakup isn't so simple, since they work together.
After trouble began in their personal lives, it obviously spilled over into their professional lives. It got complicated. It now drew in all of her friends and her business associates, primarily Amy and myself and the office staff.
Prior to the prenuptial, Les was really nice, but we all saw a total different person after he returned in January. Les and Deb would argue, and Les would speak very ugly to her, very short with her, very catty with her.
Still, Deborah does all she can to move forward with her life.
When their relationship began to break down, Deborah did make herself available on the dating websites again, and she, in fact, started having other dates.
One night, it was getting really late, way past 11 o'clock, and she needed to stay at the office and continue to do a little paperwork.
Hello?
That's where all the problems started.
As Deborah finally departs for the night, she makes a horrifying realization.
Lights would be on at 1 or 2 in the morning.
Deborah came to me one day and said, Amy, I think Les is sleeping in my office. And I'm like, what? Les can't be sleeping in your office. I would go and drive by at 2 o'clock in the morning to see if there were any lights on, particularly in Deborah's office upstairs. And sometimes I would see a light on.
So I personally confronted Les about doing it. And of course he denied it.
But as the weeks go by, strange things also start happening back at Deborah's house.
Charlie! Charlie! Here, Charlie!
One night, her dogs were missing.
Charlie! Charlie, come! Come! Damn it! Charlie, come! Charlie! Charlie! Come! Oh my God!
There, along a route Deborah travels frequently, she finds her dog dead. It's all too eerie to consider an accident.
Deborah's pets were her children, and they were so important to her, and she simply did not know how to handle it.
The following Monday, Deborah doesn't show up for work.
This is strange. Still nothing?
When I got to work on Monday morning, her first patient was at 10 o'clock, and Deborah didn't show up. And I called her, and I called her about 4 or 5 times. She didn't answer the phone.
Okay, well, did anybody at all see her over the weekend?
Last time I saw her was when she left the office on Thursday.
Me too. That was 4 days ago. Lester, please tell me you saw Deborah over the weekend.
I haven't seen her. I don't know where she's at.
Okay, well, we can't just stand here and do nothing.
We should call the police.
I'd worked with Deborah for 2 years, and I'd never known Deborah to miss an appointment or counsel an appointment. Amy was very scared.
Yes, hello. My name is Amy Tinch, and I would like to report a missing person.
Texas Rangers immediately take the case, starting with a welfare check at Deborah's house.
Hello? Miss Houchin? Anyone home?
Deborah was known to wear her glasses on a chain around her neck. When you walk in the house, the first thing I find are the glasses. They're broken. There's a blood smear on the lens.
Deborah's purse and keys are on the table, but no sign of Deborah herself.
There were actually blood smears from the living area all the way into the garage area.
It appeared to these rangers that some sort of violent action had taken place inside Deborah's house.
I go upstairs and find bleach spots on the carpet on the stairs. Indicated to me someone tried to clean something up.
Got something.
Four days after anyone last saw 56-year-old Deborah Houchin, police have discovered disturbing evidence inside her house.
We found a bullet that had blood and tissue on it that was laying in the middle of the floor.
.38. Spent.
As Texas Rangers take in the rest of the scene, they soon set eyes on something of interest.
When they found her computer, it was on dating sites. The last thing she was doing was looking at her profile.
But despite the ominous evidence, no Deborah. Police must find her and call an immediate meeting with Deborah's office mates.
We were just in disbelief. Everybody was trying to piece it together, what could have happened. Nobody knew what to do. We just all knew that we were in shock.
So we'll need to speak to each of you before we leave.
Of course, anything we can do to help.
Everyone that we talked to was more than willing to talk to us. They came forward, they told us their locations, they gave us all the information we asked for and were more than helpful, except for Lester Winningham.
Thank you. Sir, you mind sticking around for a few minutes? We'll ask you some questions about your friend.
I'm sorry, I really don't have anything that can help you. But she was walking around bragging about 400 hits that she got on her new dating profile. I think those are the guys you probably need to be talking to.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too.
We knew from Deborah's friends and from her computer, Deborah has done some online dating and was supposed to actually meet a date. I believe the day or the next day.
Right away, officers meet with Deborah's date, George Babb.
Well, I really don't know her. I mean, we were going to meet actually for the first time on Friday, face to face.
Last Friday?
Yeah, we had plans, but she called on Thursday and canceled.
George Babb is possibly the last person Deborah spoke to. There's never any indication that they had met before, but only talked on the phone.
Rangers don't think George Babb is good for this crime, so as they wait to confirm his alibi, they move on to other leads.
In Deborah's case, there were other suspects that we had to eliminate. Deborah had an ex-husband. Ex-husbands get angry. You have to look at that.
But before detectives bite into anything of interest, Deborah's friend Amy comes forward with a chilling tale.
I've been racking my brain ever since I saw you last. And there's something that you should know.
Okay.
One night about 10:30, there was a pounding on my front door. And it's Deborah. And she is in a frantic mode.
Amy? Amy! Bruce, Amy! Wake up! Please wake up. Amy! Bruce! I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm
Deborah,
sorry.
you okay?
No, I'm scared.
I said, what in the world's going on?
Wait. You're scared.
I'm
scared of what?
I'm really scared of Lester. Look at this. It's all right here. He's a financial disaster.
Deborah was just talking a million miles an hour. She was very, very upset. She was showing me documents from the collection agencies and bankruptcy information. She had documentation of a very failed man, and It became easy apparent to Deborah that he was coming into the relationship primarily for a financial gain.
He just wanted me for my money. That is why he got so mad about the prenup.
Debbie, you've got to call the police.
And say what? My ex-fiancé scares me?
Exactly,
Yes,
yeah.
He's done nothing to me? No, I'll be fine. I changed all the locks. Amy, I gotta go. If anything ever happens to me, if anything ever happens to me, promise me, you'll look at Lester. Promise me, Amy. Okay?
I should have made her go to the police right then.
I'm really angry at myself that I didn't foresee that something. I'm a therapist, but we don't see everything. And with all the years of practice that we had in our clinic, well over 100 years cumulatively, not one doctor saw this coming.
But what police don't yet realize is that 3 days earlier, an auto mechanic in nearby Cook County arrives at work only to find something that's definitely not right. One day after anyone else last saw Arlington resident Deborah Houchin, an auto mechanic in rural Cook County walks up on a frightening scene.
There was a obviously burned human body, still smoldering. You could tell the body was a female, but other than that, there was really no distinguishing features because of the condition that the body was in.
When news of this discovery makes its way to Deborah's co-workers 3 days later, they soon make a horrible realization.
Turns out the woman was wearing some jewelry and, well, that looked familiar.
Oh my God. Those are Deborah's.
Yes, hello, my name is Elisa Sample. I'm calling about the Jane Doe in Munster.
They said that the jewelry they're showing we think belonged to Deborah. And so we actually obtained dental records of Deborah, got that over to the medical examiner's office, and pretty quickly they were able to tell us that our victim was Deborah Houchin.
With Deborah's fate tragically confirmed, her friends and family do their best to cope. But not everyone is grieving.
How'd you figure it out, huh?
Excuse me?
Deborah. How'd you know it was her they pulled from the fire?
I don't know, I just put two and two together, I guess.
He basically looked at me and patted me on the shoulder, and he said,
"Well, aren't you a smart one?"
It was just eerie. It was like a different person was looking through his eyes at me. I could tell that he wasn't concerned.
Murphy.
Hello, Detective. This is Elisa Sample. I know you've already spoken to Amy about her coworker Lester, but I just had the strangest interaction.
Look, I can't say too much right now, but be patient. And we're on it.
Turns out Texas Rangers have been watching Lester for days, and what they've discovered isn't good.
First of all, we knew there was a volatile relationship.
You want me to stop?
We knew after the body had been identified that Lester had withdrew $20,000 from his bank account because we had gotten his bank records, and he had applied for an expedited passport. He was fleeing the country.
Here you go.
With suspicions mounting around Deborah's ex-boyfriend, officers head for Lester's home with search warrant in hand.
What Deborah never knew was that Les moved next door to our office. I really believe that Les wanted to watch Deborah to see her come and go.
But not long into the Rangers' search, they are interrupted.
What's going on here?
Mr. Winningham?
While we were there, he shows up at his house, and I had an arrest warrant in hand.
You're under arrest for the murder of Deborah Houchin. You have the right to remain silent.
And I personally arrested him and booked him into the Tarrant County Jail.
Let's go.
Meanwhile, officers continue the search, and there, in Lester Winningham's car, they find all the incriminating evidence they need.
We located a small amount of blood in the trunk lining of his vehicle. That DNA proved to belong to Deborah Houchin.
Though Winningham never confesses, officers now have enough information to piece together what happened to Deborah on the frightful night she disappeared.
I think what happened is Deborah had a very thriving practice. She had a lovely home in North Arlington. She had money in the bank, where at the other end of the spectrum, Les really didn't have much. And Les went home and just stewed about it and got madder and madder and madder, and finally went over to Deborah's house.
Put it down. Put the gun down. You don't have to do this. Please don't do this to me. Please don't.
I believe she was shot in the back, drug out to the garage, and at that point was probably wrapped up in the tarp. Rope was put around the tarp and was loaded into Lester's trunk. The coroner's report indicated that she probably was alive after that third shot. You can just hope that she didn't suffer for long.
After Winningham killed her, he probably panicked to some degree, and he realized that he had to dispose of the body, obviously in the hopes that no one would be able to connect the dots at a later date.
How anybody can do something to somebody so kind.
On October 12, 2007, Lester Winningham is convicted of first-degree homicide and sentenced to life in prison, where he dies 10 years later in 2017.
I was in shock that somebody that was so awesome and so caring and loving is no longer here with us due to somebody that was so hateful and so jealous of something so little, money.
I've lost people in my family to an illness, but a murder is different. Me and her family, all of her patients, everybody else. But it's been a long, rough road. And it'd be nice to find some peace that I haven't been able to find since the night she died.
There are murders that shock community for a day, a week, perhaps a year, and then there are murders that refuse to disappear. They remain buried inside old evidence boxes, faded photographs, unanswered questions, and memories that become harder to carry with every passing decade. On the morning of September 1st, 1979, in the small Pennsylvania town of Monica, a 23-year-old woman named Janet Walsh was found dead in her own bedroom. She had gone out dancing with friends only hours earlier. She had laughed. She had talked. She had returned home. And by sunrise, she was gone. For more than 30 years, investigators would struggle to answer one question that haunted Janet's family and the people who knew her. Who killed Janet Walsh? At first, police believed the answer might be close. Too close. There was no obvious break-in, no shattered window, no kicked-in door. Her front door was chained shut. Whoever entered her apartment appeared to have been allowed inside. The killer had not stormed into Janet's home like a stranger. Someone had crossed that threshold. Someone Janet apparently knew. And somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, that person turned a familiar place into a murder scene. Janet had spent the final night of her life celebrating the Labor Day weekend. She and 3 friends went from bar to bar, dancing and drinking. It was the kind of night that seemed ordinary in 1979. Young people filled local clubs. Music spilled into parking lots. Cars moved through the darkness. Nobody knew that one of the women laughing beneath the colored lights would soon become the center of a homicide investigation that would last for decades. Janet eventually returned to her apartment. The estimated time of death was around 5 a.m. The cause was strangulation, apparently involving the light blue bandana around her neck. Her hands had been tied behind her back using the belt or tie from her own bathrobe. She was found wearing only a short nightgown, face down on the bed. The scene was disturbing precisely because it did not look chaotic. There was no obvious explosion of violence. No dramatic struggle had destroyed the room. The bedroom remained strangely orderly. For investigators entering the apartment in those first hours, that silence was almost louder than anything else. A young woman was dead. Someone had killed her, and the person responsible appeared to have left very little behind. The investigation began immediately, but investigators were working in a different era. DNA profiling, as modern investigators know it, did not exist. Sophisticated genetic genealogy was decades away. Crime scene technology was limited. Evidence that would eventually become decisive could sit unnoticed because nobody yet possessed the scientific tools needed to understand what it contained. Detective Andy Gall was only 25 years old when he responded to Janet's apartment. It was his first homicide investigation. He entered a room that would remain in his memory for the rest of his career. The first questions were brutally simple. Who knew Janet? Who had seen her that night? Who could have entered the apartment? Who had a reason to hurt her? Investigators began reconstructing the final hours. Janet had been out with friends. At one nightclub, she had danced with a stranger named Robert McGrail. He was interested in her. He asked questions about where she lived. According to investigators, another man eventually showed him the location of Janet's apartment. That detail immediately raised alarms. A stranger had seen Janet. A stranger knew where she lived. And then Janet was murdered. McGrail became one of the people investigators scrutinized. But he was not the only possibility. Janet had separated from her husband, Scott Walsh, only months earlier. The marriage was breaking apart. Investigators naturally examined the estranged husband. Then there was Janet's employer, Ronald Sakatsi. Police learned that Janet and Ron had been involved in a relationship after her separation. He had also been seen at bars Janet visited on the night she died. Then another name emerged. Victor Sakatsi, who was not related to Ronald, lived nearby and had apparently known Janet. The list continued to grow. 5 major suspects eventually occupied investigators' attention, each bringing a different theory, a different possibility, a different unanswered question. But suspicion is not proof. A person can look suspicious because of circumstance. A person can lie for reasons unrelated to murder. A person can have a motive and still be innocent. Investigators needed something stronger. They needed evidence that could connect one individual to Janet's death. In 1979, that evidence remained out of reach. Police interviewed roughly 20 people during the first years of the investigation. They checked stories. They examined relationships. They pursued leads. But no witness had seen the murder. No confession arrived. No forensic test pointed decisively toward one person. The case began to cool. The town moved on. The newspapers eventually stopped putting Janet's name on the front page. But her family did not move on. For them, September 1st, 1979, was not history. It was yesterday. Every birthday became another reminder. Every holiday carried an absence. Every unanswered question became heavier. Janet's brother Francesco Calcieri would later describe the emotional damage caused by decades of uncertainty. The family did not simply lose Janet. They lost the certainty of knowing what had happened to her. Then, years after the murder, the case produced another strange turn. In 1983, investigators heard about Victor Sakatsi, a man who lived only a short distance from Janet. He reportedly told a waitress that he had known Janet and had dated her shortly before the murder. Investigators examined the claim. They discovered that Victor had been at the same nightclub Janet visited on her final night. His story attracted attention. But once again, attention was not enough. There were suspicions. There were theories. There were people who seemed capable of knowing more than they admitted. Yet the central problem remained unchanged. There was no physical evidence that could identify the killer. The years continued. The suspects aged. The original investigators aged. Some people died. Memories faded. Witnesses became harder to locate. A case that had once filled police files became an old case. And an old case can become a dangerous thing, not because investigators stop caring, but because time destroys information. Buildings change. Roads change. People move. Relationships disappear. Evidence deteriorates. The people who knew the truth may forget details or die without ever speaking. In Janet's case, however, one thing survived: the physical evidence. Items collected from the apartment remained in police custody. Sheets, clothing, the material from the scene. Evidence that had seemed almost silent in 1979 was still waiting. Nobody knew that inside those old pieces of fabric might be the answer investigators had been missing for more than 3 decades. By the 2000s, forensic science had changed dramatically. DNA could transform an investigation. Biological material that once seemed meaningless could potentially identify the person who left it. Investigators began looking at Janet's case again. The old suspects were not forgotten. They were revisited. Their stories were examined against evidence that did not exist when the original investigation began. Detective Andy Gall remained connected to the case. He had never completely let it go. And when the cold case investigation reopened the door, investigators began looking for something the killer could not have anticipated in 1979. DNA. It was a race between time and science. If usable biological material remained, investigators might finally be able to compare it against the surviving suspects. The first task was elimination. Scott Walsh was tested. He was excluded. Ronald Sakatsi was tested. He was excluded. Victor Sakatsi was tested. He was excluded. 3 names disappeared from the genetic equation, but 2 important possibilities remained. Robert McGrail. And another man whose name had once seemed less dangerous because investigators believed he had an alibi, Scott Hopkins. Hopkins had known Janet. More importantly, he had admitted having a sexual relationship with her during the summer of 1979. Yet, back in 1979, investigators had believed he could not have committed the murder. He had told police he was home. People had reportedly been staying with him that night. His story appeared supported. For decades, that alibi helped keep him away from the center of the investigation. But DNA does not care how convincing an old alibi sounds. DNA does not care how many years have passed. If biological evidence survived, it could ask a question the old investigation never could. Was Scott Hopkins physically connected to Janet Walsh's bedroom on the night she died? Investigators began moving carefully. McGrail, by then living in Massachusetts, was contacted. He had remained on the investigative radar for years. His history with the case was complicated. He had been questioned in 1979. He had undergone a polygraph examination. Decades later, investigators wanted his DNA. But McGrail did not immediately cooperate voluntarily. That meant detectives had to find another way. Meanwhile, Hopkins had also become a focus. The investigation was no longer about theories. It was about comparison. Investigators needed a DNA sample from Hopkins. They needed to know whether the genetic material recovered from Janet's belongings belonged to him. The process was deliberate. Detectives eventually obtained a discarded drinking cup connected to Hopkins. The material on the cup could be tested. And then came the result investigators had spent decades waiting for. The DNA profile matched. It was not a vague resemblance. It was a match that gave investigators a probable cause they needed to obtain an official court-authorized sample. Hopkins was no longer simply an old suspect. He was now connected genetically to biological material recovered from Janet's crime scene. But even then, detectives knew the case was not over. A DNA match does not automatically explain a murder. Hopkins had admitted that he and Janet had been sexually involved. If the biological material came from consensual sexual contact before the murder, the defense could argue that its presence was innocent. Investigators needed context. They needed to know where the DNA was located. That detail would become critical. The testing showed Hopkins' DNA was associated with several items connected to Janet's body in the murder scene, including her nightgown, the material used to bind her hands, and the sheet covering her body. Suddenly, the old case looked different. The evidence was no longer simply a list of suspects. It was a physical sequence. Janet had been found restrained. Her hands had been tied. A piece of clothing had been used around her neck. Biological evidence associated with Hopkins was found on items connected to the crime. Investigators believed the pattern could not be explained away as simply the residue of a previous consensual encounter. Prosecutors now had something the original investigators had never possessed: a scientific link between a suspect and the physical evidence surrounding Janet's death. In January 2012, more than 32 years after Janet Walsh was murdered, Gregory Scott Hopkins was arrested. Detective Andy Gall reportedly brought with him the same handcuffs he had carried in 1979. The symbolism was almost unbearable. In the beginning, Gall had been a young patrolman entering his first murder scene. Now he was an older investigator returning to the case with evidence that could finally change everything. Hopkins faced a murder charge. The man who had once appeared to investigators as an alibied suspect was now accused of killing Janet. For Janet's family, the arrest was not simply a police development. It was a reopening of a wound that had never healed. 30 years earlier, they had been told that the case might never be solved. Now the accused killer was finally standing in front of them. But an arrest is not a conviction. The case still had to survive court. The defense could challenge the DNA. It could challenge the interpretation of the evidence. It could challenge the circumstances of Hopkins' relationship with Janet. It could point to the original investigation. It could point to the other suspects. It could ask whether the evidence truly proved murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution had to build the story carefully. They needed to explain why the DNA was significant. They needed to explain why it appeared on multiple items. They needed to convince jurors that the evidence was not simply the residue of a relationship. and they needed to explain the larger crime scene. Janet had not merely died. She had been restrained. She had been strangled. Her killer had left her body face down in her bedroom. The prosecution argued that when the evidence was considered together, the DNA formed part of a much larger picture. The defense fought back. Hopkins had maintained that he had not been with Janet when she was killed. The old alibi was brought back into the spotlight. People who had been present at Hopkins' home were examined. The jury would have to decide whether the physical evidence outweighed decades-old testimony about where Hopkins had been. The trial became a collision between memory and science. One side pointed backward to 1979, to what people remembered. The other pointed toward evidence preserved since 1979, evidence that had survived long enough to speak in a language no witness could alter. The courtroom became the place where Janet's final hours were reconstructed once again. Witnesses spoke about the young woman they remembered. Investigators explained what they found when they entered the apartment. Forensic experts addressed the evidence. The prosecution called Dr. Cyril Wecht, a prominent forensic pathologist, to interpret aspects of the crime scene. The defense presented its own challenge to the state's interpretation of the DNA and physical evidence. For Janet's family, sitting through the testimony meant reliving the morning they had spent decades trying to understand. The murder was no longer an old photograph. It was being spoken aloud in court. Every detail returned. The apartment, the bedroom, the restraint, the bandana, the unanswered questions, and the name of the man accused of causing it all. The trial lasted 8 days. 40 witnesses testified. Hopkins himself took the stand. The jury had to separate emotion from evidence. They had to determine whether the state had proven its case. The question was not whether Janet had been murdered. That was certain. The question was whether Gregory Scott Hopkins was responsible. After hearing the evidence, the jury deliberated for approximately 6 hours. Then the verdict came. Guilty of third-degree murder. The verdict was significant because third-degree murder in Pennsylvania does not require proof that the defendant specifically intended to kill. The jury found Hopkins guilty of the offense under the state's legal standard. For Janet's family, the courtroom suddenly became quiet. More than 3 decades of uncertainty had reached a legal conclusion. Francesco Calcieri later described the overwhelming emotion of hearing the verdict. For him, it was not simply a courtroom result. It was a message to his sister. "Jan, we got him." The sentence followed. In 2014, Hopkins was sentenced to 8 to 16 years in prison. The case that had once seemed impossible to solve had finally reached a verdict. But solving a murder does not erase the murder. That is the part of cold cases that statistics cannot capture. The police can make an arrest. A jury can return a verdict. A judge can impose a sentence. Yet none of those events can return the person who was taken. Janet remained 23 years old forever. She would never grow older. She would never see another Labor Day weekend. She would never move to another apartment, change jobs, make new friends, grow old, or meet the people she might otherwise have met. Her future ended in a bedroom in Monaco before sunrise. And for the people who loved her, time did not move in the same way. The calendar continued, but the question remained. Who did this? Why did it happen? What exactly occurred in those final minutes? Some questions were answered, others were not. The conviction established legal responsibility, but a murder investigation can contain mysteries that no verdict completely resolves. Investigators have spent decades examining other suspects. Some have been cleared by DNA. Others have been scrutinized because of relationships, statements, or circumstances. Their names became part of the history of the case. But suspicion alone could never make someone guilty. The evidence eventually narrowed the case to Hopkins. That distinction matters. A cold case is not solved by choosing the person who looks most suspicious. It is solved when evidence can withstand scrutiny. In Janet's case, preserved biological evidence became the bridge between 1979 and the courtroom more than 30 years later. It was a bridge built from science. And that is what makes the case so haunting. The killer could not have known what DNA technology would become. In 1979, the evidence sat quietly. Years passed. Decades passed. The world changed around it. Computers transformed investigations. Forensic laboratories became more sophisticated. DNA analysis became one of the most powerful tools in criminal justice. But the evidence from Janet's apartment remained frozen in time. It waited, and eventually, investigators returned to it with the technology needed to make it speak. There's another reason Janet Walsh's case remains disturbing. The murder happened in a place that should have been safe. Home, bedroom, bed. The ordinary details of domestic life became part of a homicide investigation. Janet had gone out dancing. She had returned home. At some point, another person was inside her apartment. There was no dramatic warning, no public confrontation, no crowd watching. The danger was behind a closed door. The scene investigators encountered was described as orderly, almost unnaturally so. That calmness became one of the strangest features of the case. A violent death had occurred, yet the room did not necessarily advertise a struggle. It forced investigators to imagine what had happened when nobody else was watching. The absence of forced entry also shaped the investigation from the beginning. If the door was secured from inside, then the killer may have been someone Janet recognized or trusted enough to let inside. That single fact expanded the emotional dimension of the case. The threat was not necessarily a stranger hiding in the darkness. It could have been someone from her social world, someone who knew her, someone she had met before, someone who could enter without immediately triggering fear. That possibility explains why investigators examined her husband, her employer, men she had met socially, and people who had shown romantic interest in her. The case became a study in proximity. Who was close enough to know her routines? Who knew where she lived? Who knew she might be home? Who had access? Who had an opportunity? And who left evidence behind? For years, the answers refused to align. Then DNA changed the equation. The investigation no longer depended entirely on reconstructing human memory. The evidence preserved from the crime scene could be tested directly. The science did not remember incorrectly. It did not age. It did not forget. It simply remained there. And when investigators compared the profile, one name rose above the others. Scott Hopkins, the same man who had once been considered alibied, the same man who had acknowledged a relationship with Janet, the same man whose biological material ultimately became central to the prosecution's case. The old investigation had not necessarily been useless. It had gathered the evidence that later made the breakthrough possible. Every photograph, every item preserved, every statement recorded in 1979 could become important decades later. That is one of the hidden truths of cold case investigations. Investigators may not know which piece of evidence will matter. They preserve it anyway. And sometimes the future provides a missing technology. For the detectives who stayed with Janet's case, the breakthrough was also deeply personal. Andy Gall had entered Janet's apartment as a young officer in 1979. He watched the case become cold. He watched years pass. Yet the investigation never completely disappeared from his mind. When new forensic techniques became available, he had a chance to revisit the evidence. The eventual arrest was therefore more than procedural success. It represented the completion of a circle that had begun on a September morning more than 30 years earlier. Gall had seen the crime scene at the beginning. He was involved when the investigation returned decades later, and he participated in the arrest that finally placed the suspect in custody. The symbolism of using the old handcuffs was impossible to miss. The young investigator from 1979 had returned to the same unanswered question as an older detective. The difference was that this time he had evidence. The family, meanwhile, had endured something investigators could not fully understand. Police officers can close a file. Families cannot. There is no such thing as closing a loved one's death. There is only learning to live around the empty space. Janet's brother and friends carried her memory through decades in which there was no certainty about who had killed her. Every anniversary brought the same date back, September 1st. A day that once represented the end of summer became permanently linked to tragedy. The case also illustrates how victims can disappear from public memory even when their cases remain active inside law enforcement files. Janet's name was once printed in newspapers. Then the headline stopped. New crimes replaced old crimes. New generations grew up without knowing who she was. But inside her family, she remained exactly where she had always been. Young, alive, laughing, preparing for a night out. That contrast is at the heart of every long-running cold case. Time changes everything except the moment of loss. The world moves forward. The victim does not. And when a case is finally solved, the solution arrives in a world almost unrecognizable from the one in which the murder happened. Cars have changed. Phones have changed. Police technology has changed. People have changed. But the question remains the same. What happened to Janet Walsh? The answer took decades to emerge. The case also left behind a warning about the limits of certainty. In 1979, investigators had multiple suspects. Some appeared to have motives. Some had relationships with Janet. Some had suspicious circumstances around them. One man was a stranger who had met her at a nightclub. Another was her estranged husband. Another was connected to her workplace. Another had reportedly claimed a relationship with her. And another, Hopkins, had been involved with Janet, but maintained he was home when she was killed. A lesser investigation might have chosen the most obvious suspect and stopped there. Instead, the case remained unresolved because investigators could not prove what they believed. That restraint mattered. Years later, DNA would eliminate several people who had once been considered possibilities. It would help separate suspicion from evidence. Scott Walsh was excluded. Ronald Sakatsi was excluded. Victor Sakatsi was excluded. McGrail's DNA was ultimately excluded as well. One by one, the genetic evidence reduced the field. The process was not dramatic. It was scientific. Compare. Exclude. Compare again. The old theories became less important as the physical evidence became more precise. That is why the eventual resolution was so powerful. The answer did not come from a sudden confession. It came from evidence that had been waiting for technology to catch up. The case became an example of how forensic science can revive an investigation that once appeared permanently frozen. But there's a darker side to that progress. The DNA breakthrough could not happen in 1979. The technology simply did not exist in the necessary form. That meant Janet's family had to wait. Not weeks, not months, decades. They had to live through birthdays without answers. They had to watch the investigation become a story from another era. They had to wonder whether the killer was still walking free. And perhaps the most painful possibility was this. The person responsible might be living an ordinary life, while Janet's family was still living with the consequences of her death. The eventual arrest changed that, but it could not change the years that had already been lost. A conviction could not restore Janet. It could only establish accountability for what had happened to her. More than 4 decades later, Janet Walsh's name still carries the weight of that morning. The case began as a local tragedy and became a decades-long investigation. It survived changing detectives, changing technology, changing theories, and changing generations. The evidence survived, too. That may be the most remarkable part of the story. In a world where memories disappear and witnesses age, physical evidence can remain patient. A piece of fabric does not forget. A biological trace does not decide to move away. An old evidence box does not suddenly wake up one morning and volunteer an explanation. But science can open that box again. It can ask new questions of old evidence. It can turn something invisible into something measurable. And sometimes that is enough to change everything. Janet's murder had once been described as a cold case. For years, it seemed destined to remain that way. Then the investigation returned. Old suspects were reconsidered. DNA was extracted and compared. One by one, possibilities disappeared until the evidence pointed toward Gregory Scott Hopkins. His arrest in 2012 transformed a decades-old mystery into a criminal prosecution. His conviction in 2014 gave the case its legal ending. But perhaps there is no true ending to a story like this. There is only a point where the unanswered question becomes an answered one. Janet was murdered. Her family waited. Investigators persisted. Science caught up. And the person convicted of her murder was finally held accountable. Yet if you strip away the courtroom, the DNA results, the police files, and the headlines, one fact remains painfully simple. Janet Walsh was 23 years old. She had friends. She had plans. She had a life that was supposed to continue. On the night before her death, she went dancing. She came home. Somewhere in the hours before dawn, the ordinary world she knew became something else. And when the sun rose, Janet was gone. For more than 30 years, the people who loved her had no answer. Then one day, an old piece of evidence spoke. It spoke through science. It spoke through a DNA profile preserved from a forgotten crime scene. And suddenly, the silence of September 1st, 1979, was broken. That is why the Janet Walsh case remains more than another entry in a list of solved murders. It is a story about time, about what time destroys, about what time preserves, and about the strange possibility that an investigation can sleep for decades without truly dying. In 1979, investigators entered Janet's apartment with limited tools and almost unlimited questions. They did what they could. They documented the scene. They collected evidence. They interviewed people. They built suspect lists. They followed leads. But they could not force science to exist before its time. The case eventually went cold. Yet the evidence stayed alive. 30 years later, detectives returned to it. The old names came back. The old theories were examined. The old evidence was tested with new technology. And the case that once seemed destined to become an unsolved mystery finally produced an answer. Hopkins was arrested. A jury heard the evidence. A verdict was returned. A sentence followed. The legal system had spoken. But the final image is not of a courtroom. It is not of handcuffs. It is not of a laboratory. It is of Janet herself, frozen forever at 23. A young woman leaving a nightclub. A young woman returning home. A young woman whose family expected to see her again. They never did. For them, the most important date was never the date of the arrest. It was never the date of the verdict. It was September 1st, 1979. The morning when a phone call changed everything. The morning when a family discovered that Janet would never come home again. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson of the case. A murder can become cold. A file can become old. A suspect can disappear into ordinary life. A community can forget the details. But the victim does not become less important because time passes. Janet Walsh did not become a statistic. She remained a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman whose life ended violently before she had the chance to see what came next. More than 30 years later, science helped answer the question that had haunted her family. More than 4 decades later, her name remains attached to a case that demonstrated just how long justice can take to arrive. And somewhere inside that story is a quiet, unsettling thought. The killer may believe that time protects the guilty, that memories fade, that witnesses disappear, that evidence becomes meaningless. But sometimes time does the opposite. Sometimes time preserves the one thing the killer cannot escape, evidence. And when the right investigator returns, when the right technology finally exists, when an old file is open again, the silence can end. Janet Walsh's story began with a night of dancing and ended with a courtroom verdict more than 3 decades later. Between those two moments were years of grief, suspicion, frustration, scientific discovery, and persistence. The mystery was not solved quickly. It was not solved easily. But it was solved. And for a family that had spent decades asking who took Janet from them, the answer finally existed, not as a rumor, not as a theory, not as a headline, but as a verdict. For years, the case appeared to have reached its ending. A suspect had been identified. DNA had connected him to biological evidence recovered from Janet Walsh's bedroom. A jury had heard the testimony. A verdict had been delivered. A sentence had been imposed. To the outside world, the mystery seemed finished. But cold cases have a way of refusing to stay finished. Sometimes the most dramatic moment does not come when a suspect is arrested. Sometimes it comes years later, when the evidence itself is forced back into courtroom and the certainty surrounding a conviction begins to crack. That is what happened in the case of Janet Walsh. The woman at the center of this story had been dead for decades. Her name had already passed through multiple generations of investigators. The original crime scene belonged to another era, yet the evidence collected from that bedroom eventually became the foundation of a prosecution that would change the lives of everyone connected to the case. Gregory Scott Hopkins had been convicted of third-degree murder in 2013 and sentenced to 8 to 16 years in prison in 2014. The prosecution had argued that DNA recovered from Janet's nightgown, the bathrobe tie used to bind her hands, and the sheet covering her body connected Hopkins to the crime. The evidence was powerful enough to convince a Beaver County jury, but Hopkins continued to deny that he had killed Janet. He acknowledged that he had been involved with her romantically, but maintained that he was not with her when she died. His defense challenged the interpretation of the forensic evidence and the circumstances under which investigators obtained his DNA. The case did not disappear after the verdict. Instead, it entered another legal battle. This time, the question was no longer simply, who killed Janet Walsh? The question became more complicated. Had the state proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt? Had the evidence been properly interpreted? Had the prosecution crossed the constitutional line? And could a conviction based heavily on decades-old forensic evidence survive years of appellate scrutiny? The answer would eventually change the entire meaning of the case. The story of the DNA had always contained a strange tension. Investigators had preserved evidence from Janet's bedroom in 1979, but the technology needed to interpret the biological material did not exist in the form available decades later. When Pennsylvania State Police reopened the case around 2010, they were not starting from nothing. They were returning to evidence that had been sitting quietly for years. The old nightgown, the restraint, the bedding. Items that had once seemed to contain little visible information were subjected to new forensic examination. Investigators found seminal DNA on several pieces of evidence. The discovery transformed the investigation. Suddenly, the question was not simply who might have known Janet. Investigators could ask who had left biological material on objects surrounding her body. The profile eventually pointed toward Hopkins. The prosecution's theory depended heavily on the location of the DNA. It was not merely that Hopkins had once had a sexual relationship with Janet. That fact was already known. The critical issue was where the biological material was found and what that location could mean. Prosecutors argued that the distribution of the material supported their theory of the murder. Defense attorneys argued that the DNA could have been deposited during consensual sexual encounter before Janet's death. That distinction became the battlefield. The same biological evidence could be interpreted in dramatically different ways depending on when and how it arrived at the scene. In court, forensic science became a story of timing. When did the DNA get there? Under what circumstances? Did it prove that Hopkins was present when Janet was murdered? Or did it merely prove something investigators already knew, that he had been intimate with her? The prosecution presented expert testimony, supporting its interpretation. The defense attempted to undermine it. The jury ultimately accepted the state's case and convicted Hopkins. But the scientific controversy did not end with the verdict. It followed the case into the appeals process. There was another piece of evidence that had become central to the prosecution, a discarded drinking cup. Investigators had wanted Hopkins' DNA, but according to court records and contemporary reporting, he had refused to voluntarily provide a sample during the renewed investigation. Detectives instead obtained a cup he had discarded in a municipal building. The biological material from that cup became a comparison sample. It ultimately matched the DNA profile associated with evidence from Janet's crime scene. To investigators, this was the bridge they needed. The suspect was no longer simply someone who had known Janet. His genetic profile corresponded with biological material found on objects recovered from the scene. The arrest followed in January 2012, more than 3 decades after Janet's death. The passage of time made the arrest extraordinary. People who had been young in 1979 were now elderly. People who had once remembered Janet as a 23-year-old woman had spent decades carrying the memory of a crime that seemed destined to remain unanswered. Hopkins himself was now an older man. He had built a life after 1979. He had become involved in local politics and served as a Bridgewater borough councilman. The contrast was striking. The murder belonged to an era of disco, landline telephones, paper files, and forensic methods that now seem primitive. The suspect was living in a world of modern DNA laboratories and digital records. Then, suddenly, the two eras collided. Investigators placed Hopkins under arrest. The cold case was no longer cold, but an arrest creates a new problem. It must survive a courtroom. And in a courtroom, suspicion is irrelevant unless evidence meets the legal standard required for conviction. The trial placed Janet's final hours under a microscope. Jurors heard about the condition of her body. They heard that she had been found face down on her bed, her hands restrained behind her back, with a bandana around her neck. The evidence in the apartment was presented again, this time decades after it had been collected. The room that investigators had entered in 1979 existed only through photographs, reports, testimony, and preserved evidence. The original officers had aged. Some witnesses had aged. Some had died. But the objects recovered from a room could still be examined. That was a strange power of forensic evidence. It could outlive everyone who had touched the case. The prosecution relied on experts to explain the significance of the DNA. One of those experts was forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht. The state argued that the distribution of Hopkins's DNA on multiple items was consistent with its theory of the murder. The defense challenged that interpretation. The attorneys argued that Hopkins's prior sexual relationship with Janet provided an innocent explanation for the presence of his DNA. The jurors therefore faced an extraordinarily difficult task. They were being asked to reconstruct events that had happened more than 30 years earlier, using evidence that had been preserved since the original investigation. They had to decide what happened in a bedroom where no eyewitness had seen the killing. There was no recording of the event, no modern surveillance system, no digital trail, no text messages, no GPS history, no social media posts. Only the physical evidence, the witnesses who remained, and the competing interpretations of what the evidence meant. In November 2013, after hearing the case, the jury returned its verdict. Gregory Scott Hopkins was found guilty of third-degree murder. For Janet's family, the verdict represented an emotional moment that had taken decades to arrive. Her brother Francesco Calcieri had spent years waiting for someone to be held responsible. Now the jury had spoken. The case appeared to have reached its final chapter. But the legal system had not finished with Gregory Hopkins. Hopkins was sentenced in February 2014 to 8 to 16 years in prison. The sentence gave the case something it had lacked since 1979: legal finality. At least, that was how it appeared. Yet Hopkins continued to challenge the conviction. His lawyers argued that the evidence was insufficient and that the court had made errors in handling the case. The legal process moved slowly, just as the original investigation had. Appeals were filed. Arguments were examined. Court records accumulated. The same murder that had once been investigated through handwritten reports and interviews was now being analyzed through appellate opinions and forensic disputes. In 2015, the Pennsylvania Superior Court affirmed the conviction. That decision seemed to strengthen the conclusion reached by the jury. The conviction remained. Hopkins remained in prison. Janet's family had reason to believe that the legal battle was finally over. But the story did not end there. Hopkins continued pursuing post-conviction relief. His legal team challenged the conviction again. And this time, the question surrounding the forensic evidence became even more important. The issue was not whether DNA existed. It did. The issue was what that DNA actually proved. That distinction would become the fault line running through the later proceedings. In a homicide trial, a genetic match can be extraordinarily compelling. But a match does not automatically explain the circumstances in which biological material arrived at a scene. Context matters. Timing matters. Location matters. The meaning of evidence depends on the chain of events surrounding it. And because Janet and Hopkins had admitted having a prior intimate relationship, the defense had an argument available that could not simply be ignored. The DNA might establish contact, but did it establish murder? That was the question that would eventually return the case to court. By 2020, the legal landscape had changed dramatically. The Pennsylvania Superior Court considered Hopkins's post-conviction claims. The court reviewed the case, the testimony, and the arguments surrounding the evidence. Hopkins was still serving his sentence. He had already spent years behind bars for a murder that had occurred more than 40 years earlier. Then the conviction was overturned. The decision changed everything. The man who had once been described as the killer of Janet Walsh was no longer legally convicted of her murder. The state had a choice. It could attempt to retry him, or it could decline to do so. Prosecutors ultimately chose not to retry the case. Hopkins was released after serving approximately 8 years in prison. The legal ending that had seemed so certain in 2014 disappeared. The verdict remained part of the historical record, but it was no longer a valid conviction. And suddenly the Janet Walsh case occupied a deeply uncomfortable place. A jury had once said guilty. An appellate process later overturned the conviction. The state declined to retry. Hopkins maintained his innocence. Janet's murder remained a fact, but the legal responsibility for that murder no longer rested on an active conviction. This is where the story becomes far more complicated than the headline of a solved cold case suggests. The DNA breakthrough had been real. The arrest had been real. The trial had been real. The conviction had been real. But so was the reversal. And so was the decision not to conduct another trial. The consequences continue beyond the criminal case. In 2022, Hopkins filed a federal civil lawsuit against individuals involved in the investigation, alleging constitutional violations connected to his arrest and prosecution. The case brought the old murder back into a courtroom yet again. Decades after Janet's death, the legal system was still examining the actions of the investigators who had pursued her killer. In April 2026, a federal court issued another opinion in the civil litigation. The court's summary of the history was stark. Someone had murdered Janet Walsh in 1979. Police had investigated. The case had gone cold. Roughly 30 years later, new technology had been used to test old evidence. DNA had been discovered and matched to a former suspect. Hopkins had been arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced. He had then spent 8 years in prison before his conviction was overturned in 2020, and the Commonwealth decided not to retry him. That chronology turns the entire story on its head. The investigation once looked like a textbook example of forensic science, solving a decades-old murder. Today, the record is more complicated. It is a story about a cold case, a DNA breakthrough, a conviction, an appeal, an overturned judgment, and a decision not to retry. It is also a story about the limits of certainty. A murder can be factually obvious while the identity and legal responsibility of the perpetrator remain disputed. A suspect can be convicted and later have that conviction overturned. A forensic match can be powerful and still become the subject of legal challenge. And a family can wait decades for answers only to discover that the law cannot provide the finality they hoped for. For Janet's family, none of those legal distinctions changes the central tragedy. Janet was 23 years old when her life ended. Her body was discovered in her Monica apartment on September 1st, 1979. The investigation consumed years and then decades. Her parents never received the kind of simple answer families want after murder, a clear explanation of who did it, why it happened, and why the person responsible could no longer hurt anyone else. Her father, Peter Caltry, died in 2013, just months before the trial ended. He had spent decades living with the uncertainty surrounding his daughter's death. He did not live to see the final stages of the legal battle. Her mother also died before the trial. Their absence added another layer of tragedy. The people who had wanted answers most desperately were not there to see the courtroom verdict. And yet Janet's brother remained. He attended the trial. He heard the evidence. He heard the guilty verdict. He believed the case had finally delivered justice for his sister. But years later, the conviction was gone. For a family, that kind of reversal can be devastating. The legal system speaks in terms of evidence, standards, appeals, and constitutional rights. Families speak in terms of loss. Those two languages do not always meet. A court can overturn a conviction without overturning the fact that a person was murdered. A prosecutor can decline to retry without declaring that the murder never happened. But for the family, the unanswered question returns with brutal force. Who killed Janet Walsh? The question that began in 1979 has survived every courtroom. It survived the first investigation. It survived the DNA breakthrough. It survived the arrest. It survived the conviction. It survived the appeal. And it survived the decision not to retry. There is something haunting about the physical evidence in this case. For decades, it was silent. The objects collected from Janet's bedroom could not tell investigators what had happened. They could only wait. When technology advanced, investigators found biological material that had escaped earlier detection. That discovery seemed to awaken the case. But evidence does not speak by itself. Humans interpret it. Scientists interpret it. Prosecutors interpret it. Defense attorneys interpret it. Judges interpret it. Jurors interpret it. And sometimes two sides can look at the same evidence and reach radically different conclusions. That is what happened here. The prosecution saw a pattern connecting Hopkins to the murder. The defense saw evidence that could be explained by the prior relationship between Hopkins and Janet. The jury accepted the prosecution's interpretation. Later legal proceedings ultimately overturned the conviction. That sequence is a reminder that forensic evidence is powerful, but it exists within a larger legal framework. DNA can identify whose biological material is present. It may not always tell investigators exactly when it arrived, why it arrived, or what happened afterward. Those questions require context, and context is often the hardest thing to reconstruct in a murder that happened decades earlier. Janet's case demonstrates that perfectly. The crime scene was frozen in 1979, but the interpretation of that scene changed with every new stage of the investigation. First, it was a local homicide. Then it became a cold case. Then it became a forensic breakthrough. Then it became a prosecution. Then it became a conviction. Then it became an overturned conviction. Now it remains a case whose history is inseparable from the uncertainty surrounding its final legal status. And that is perhaps the most unsettling ending of all. There is no simple final sentence to this story. No clean black and white conclusion that closes every door. Janet Walsh was murdered. That is certain. Her family spent decades searching for justice. That is certain. Investigators eventually found DNA associated with Gregory Scott Hopkins. That is documented. Hopkins was convicted by a jury. That is documented. The conviction was later overturned. That is documented. The Commonwealth decided not to retry him. That is documented. What remains is the space between those facts. The space where questions live. The space where families continue to search for certainty long after the newspapers have stopped reporting. More than 40 years after Janet Walsh was killed, her case still carries the power of a mystery because the legal system never delivered the final resolution that the original conviction seemed to promise. The file is no longer gathering dust in the same way it once did. It has been reopened, examined, litigated, overturned, and examined again. But the central tragedy remains frozen in time. A 23-year-old woman went home in 1979. Before dawn, she was dead. Somewhere between the last ordinary moments of her life and the discovery of her body, something happened that changed her family forever. Decades later, science appeared to provide an answer. Then the law questioned that answer. And now the case stands as a warning against assuming that a cold case ends the moment a suspect is arrested. Sometimes the arrest is only the beginning of another investigation. Sometimes the verdict is only the beginning of another legal battle. And sometimes, after decades of waiting, the final truth remains just beyond the reach of certainty. Janet Walsh has been gone for generations, but her name has never completely disappeared. It remains inside police files, court opinions, forensic reports, family memories, and unanswered questions. And perhaps that is why this case continues to haunt Monica, because the past did not stay buried. It came back through DNA. It came back through a courtroom. It came back through an overturned conviction. And it left behind the same question that had been waiting since September 1st, 1979. If the evidence once pointed toward an answer, but the conviction could not survive, then after all these years, who truly killed Janet Walsh? The most disturbing thing about the Janet Walsh case is not simply that a young woman was murdered and that the killer was not immediately identified. It is that, decades later, an answer appeared to emerge with the force of science, only for that answer to become the center of another legal battle. In 1979, there was no modern DNA profiling capable of identifying a person from microscopic biological material. Investigators had the physical evidence, but they did not yet have the technology to extract the full meaning from it. When the case was reopened roughly 30 years later, that changed. The old evidence was examined again. Seminal DNA was identified on several items connected to Janet's body. The profile was linked to Gregory Scott Hopkins, a man who had admitted having a sexual relationship with Janet that summer. In 2012, he was arrested. In November 2013, a jury convicted him of third-degree murder. For the Walsh family, it seemed that decades of uncertainty had finally ended, but the conviction depended heavily on a controversial interpretation of the DNA evidence. And years later, that interpretation would become the very reason the conviction collapsed. The central scientific issue was deceptively simple. Hopkins' DNA was there, but when did it get there? That question became the fault line of the entire prosecution. Hopkins had never denied having sex with Janet. He acknowledged that relationship. His defense therefore argued that finding his DNA on her clothing or bedding did not necessarily prove he was present when she was killed. The prosecution needed something more. It needed to establish that the biological material had been deposited around the time of the murder rather than weeks earlier during an earlier sexual encounter. That was where Dr. Cyril Wecht's testimony became critical. Wecht, a prominent forensic pathologist, offered an interpretation based on what was described as a topographical distribution of the semen deposits. His conclusion, presented to the jury, effectively connected the location of the biological material to the timing of the crime. It was a powerful argument. It appeared to transform DNA from evidence of contact into evidence of murder. The problem was that the methodology behind that conclusion had not been scientifically validated. The Pennsylvania Superior Court later concluded that no accepted scientific method existed for dating the age of the DNA deposits in the way Wecht had attempted. The court found that his method was not generally accepted in the forensic pathology field. That distinction became decisive. Without that testimony, the prosecution's case looked very different. The Superior Court itself recognized the problem. The court explained that, without Wecht's theory, the Commonwealth had no other evidence purporting to establish that Hopkins' DNA deposits had been made around the time of Janet's death. That mattered because Hopkins had a documented sexual relationship with Janet. A jury could therefore reasonably consider the possibility that the DNA had been deposited during an earlier consensual encounter. The scientific evidence did not disappear. The DNA still existed. The match still existed. But the interpretation of that match was no longer enough to establish when the material had been deposited. The distinction may sound technical. In a homicide trial, it can be everything. A genetic match can tell investigators that biological material came from a particular person. It does not necessarily tell them the exact moment it arrived at a location. That is the gap the prosecution attempted to bridge. And according to the appellate court, it bridged that gap using a methodology that should not have been admitted without proper scientific scrutiny. The court's 2020 ruling was devastating to the conviction. The Pennsylvania Superior Court concluded that Hopkins' trial attorney had been ineffective for failing to challenge Wecht's testimony under Pennsylvania's Fry standard. The court found that Wecht's opinion had been central to the prosecution's case and that the admission of that testimony had prejudiced Hopkins. The conviction was reversed. A new trial was ordered. The legal meaning of the original verdict changed instantly. Hopkins was no longer standing on the same legal ground as he had been when the jury convicted him. The case had returned to a position of uncertainty. There had been a conviction. There had been an 8 to 16-year sentence. Hopkins had spent years in prison. Yet the appellate court concluded that the conviction could not stand because the jury had heard scientific testimony that should have been excluded. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court later denied the Commonwealth's petition for allowance of appeal in December 2020. The decision left a new trial order in place. For Janet's family, this was a brutal reversal. They had lived through the original murder investigation. They had waited decades for an arrest. They had sat through the trial. They had heard the guilty verdict. Janet's brother Francesco Calcieri described the emotional impact of facing the accused man in court after more than 30 years of uncertainty. He had believed the verdict finally meant that his sister's killer had been identified and held accountable. Now the legal system was telling him that the conviction had been overturned. The pain was not theoretical. His family had already spent decades waiting for answers. The 2013 verdict had created the expectation that the waiting was finally over. The 2020 ruling reopened the uncertainty. A courtroom had once supplied certainty. Another courtroom had taken away. Then came another crucial development. The Commonwealth decided not to retry Hopkins. According to a federal court's 2026 account of the case, Hopkins remained incarcerated for approximately 8 years before his conviction was overturned in 2020, after which Pennsylvania declined to retry him. He was released. The murder charges did not proceed to another verdict. The legal case against him therefore ended without a second conviction. That fact is essential when describing Janet Walsh's case today. It is inaccurate to say simply that Hopkins was convicted and the case was solved. It is equally inaccurate to say that no evidence ever connected him to Janet. Both statements would leave out critical parts of the record. The documented history is more complicated. Hopkins was convicted. The conviction was overturned. The state did not retry him. And the unresolved legal questions continued into civil litigation. Hopkins then turned the legal system against the investigators themselves. After his release, he filed a federal civil lawsuit alleging that investigators had violated his constitutional rights. The allegations included malicious prosecution, fabrication of evidence, and conspiracy. Hopkins maintained that he had been wrongfully targeted. His position was that investigators had selectively interpreted the evidence and had ignored information that could have supported his innocence. He argued that the DNA investigation had been incomplete and that the scientific conclusions presented at trial were unsound. These were allegations made by Hopkins in civil litigation, not findings that should automatically be treated as established fact. But they became part of the continuing legal history of the case. The murder investigation had now evolved into a dispute over how the investigation itself had been conducted. The federal litigation illustrates how far the Janet Walsh case traveled from the original bedroom in Monica. What began as a local murder in 1979 eventually produced decades of police files, forensic testing, criminal proceedings, appellate decisions, post-conviction litigation, and a federal civil lawsuit. The case became a legal maze. Each new proceeding asked a slightly different question. Who was responsible for Janet's death? What did the DNA prove? Was a forensic testimony scientifically reliable? Did the original defense attorney challenge the evidence properly? Were investigators justified in focusing on Hopkins? Did the prosecution violate his rights? Each question opened another door, and behind every door was the same woman who had been killed more than 40 years earlier. The 2026 federal opinion provides a particularly striking modern perspective. The court described the basic history in stark terms. Janet Walsh was murdered in 1979. The investigation initially failed to produce charges. The case went cold. Roughly 30 years later, Pennsylvania State Police reopened it after receiving federal funding and used new technology to test old evidence. DNA was discovered. The profile was matched to Hopkins. He was arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced. Then, in 2020, the conviction was overturned and the Commonwealth decided not to retry him. That chronology is now part of federal judicial record. The case is therefore no longer merely an old newspaper mystery. Its history has been examined repeatedly by courts. The legal record itself demonstrates how uncertain the final answer remains. And this is where the story becomes more haunting than a conventional solved case narrative. There is a temptation to believe that DNA ends every mystery. It does not. DNA can be extraordinarily powerful, but forensic evidence must still be interpreted. A genetic profile can establish a connection between a person and biological material. The circumstances surrounding that connection still matter. In Janet's case, the existence of Hopkins' DNA was not enough to establish precisely when the deposits occurred. The prosecution relied on an additional interpretation. The appellate court later rejected that methodology as scientifically unreliable. The result was not a declaration that the DNA never existed. The result was a declaration that the scientific conclusion drawn from its distribution should not have been presented to the jury in the manner it was. That difference is enormous. Imagine the case as a chain. The first link is Janet's murder. The second is the discovery of biological evidence. The third is the identification of Hopkins' DNA. The fourth is the interpretation of where that DNA was located. The fifth is the conclusion about when it was deposited. The sixth is the conclusion that Hopkins therefore participated in the murder. The prosecution's case depended on those links holding together. The appellate court found a critical weakness in the chain. If the timing of the DNA deposit could not scientifically be established through Weck's methodology, then the final conclusion became far less certain. The jury had convicted Hopkins after hearing that testimony. But the appellate court determined that the testimony should not have been admitted in the first place. The conviction, therefore, could not stand. The tragedy is that Janet herself never had a chance to speak. Every interpretation of the case came after her death. Investigators reconstructed her final hours. Prosecutors reconstructed the crime. Defense attorneys reconstructed alternative explanations. Scientists reconstructed the meaning of biological evidence. Judges reconstructed the legal history. Jurors reconstructed the events from testimony and exhibits. But Janet could not tell anyone who entered her apartment. She could not explain what happened in those final hours. She could not identify the person who restrained her. She could not confirm or deny the competing theories. The only voice she left behind was the evidence recovered from the scene, and even that evidence required interpretation. More than 4 decades have now passed since the morning her father discovered her body. Entire generations have grown up without knowing her. The places where Janet once walked have changed. The people who knew her have grown old. Some have died. The original investigators are no longer young officers. Yet the case continues to exist because the questions remain. That is a peculiar endurance of a cold case. It does not need to dominate the headlines every day. It only needs one unanswered question. In Janet Walsh's case, that question has survived arrests, trials, convictions, appeals, and legal reversals. Who killed Janet? And if Gregory Scott Hopkins was once convicted, but that conviction was later overturned, what should the public believe about the evidence that once seemed to identify him? The honest answer is more difficult than a headline. The record establishes that Hopkins was prosecuted and convicted. It establishes that a conviction was later overturned because the trial included expert testimony about the dating and distribution of DNA that the appellate court found scientifically unreliable. It establishes that Pennsylvania declined to retry him. It establishes that Hopkins has denied killing Janet. And it establishes that Janet Walsh was murdered in 1979. What the current legal record does not provide is a new conviction identifying another person as her killer. That uncertainty cannot be filled with speculation. It cannot be filled with a dramatic theory, simply because the audience wants an ending. The absence of a final conviction is itself part of the story. And perhaps that is the most chilling reality of Janet Walsh's case. The file once seemed to have an answer, then the answer was challenged. The conviction fell. The prison doors opened. The accused man walked free. The family was left with the same impossible loss that had existed since 1979. Science had opened the case. The courts had reopened it again. And after all of that, the central mystery remained. A young woman was strangled in her apartment. Evidence was collected. Years passed. Technology changed. A DNA profile emerged. A suspect was arrested. A jury said guilty. An appellate court said the trial had been fundamentally compromised by unreliable expert testimony. The conviction disappeared. The state declined to retry. And Janet Walsh remained dead. That sequence is not a neat ending. It is a warning about how difficult truth can become when decades separate a crime from courtroom. It shows why cold cases demand patience. It shows why forensic evidence must be tested scientifically, not simply presented with authority. It shows why a conviction is not necessarily the final word. And most importantly, it shows that behind every case file is a human being whose life cannot be restored by a verdict. Janet was 23. She should have had decades ahead of her. Instead, her name became attached to one of Pennsylvania's most enduring cold case mysteries. The years have passed. The evidence has been tested. The courtroom doors have opened and closed. The verdict came. The verdict vanished. But the question remains. Who was responsible for the death of Catherine Janet Walsh? More than 40 years after that September morning, the answer is still surrounded by uncertainty. And perhaps that is why the case refuses to disappear. Because a cold case can survive without a headline. It can survive without a trial. It can survive without a conviction. All it needs is a question that nobody has been able to answer with certainty. For Janet Walsh, that question has survived for more than 4 decades. And somewhere inside the old evidence, the old reports, the old memories, and the court records, the truth of what happened in that apartment still waits to be fully understood. By 2010, the world in which Janet Walsh had been murdered was almost unrecognizable. The investigation had survived 3 decades, but the tools had changed. Detectives no longer had to rely only on old photographs, interviews, and memories. They could return to the evidence itself. A federal grant for cold cases gave Pennsylvania State Police an opportunity to reopen Janet's file. The investigation was led by Trooper Rocco DeMaialo, while serologist Ashley Mangan began examining evidence that had been preserved since 1979. What she found had escaped the eyes of the original investigators. In 1979, officers had relied on a tactile examination, sometimes described as a crunch test, to locate possible semen stains. Nothing significant was identified. Decades later, Mangan used an alternate light source, technology that had not been available during the original investigation. Suddenly, traces of sperm appeared on the bedsheet that had covered Janet's body, on the bathrobe belt used to bind her hands, and on the nightgown top she had been wearing. The evidence had been there all along. Nobody had known exactly where to look. Nobody in 1979 could have predicted that 30 years later, a different kind of light would reveal what the original investigation had missed. The discovery changed the case immediately. The biological material was evaluated for its suitability for DNA testing. Some samples were stronger than others. The most useful material came from a nightgown and the bathrobe belt. A male DNA profile was eventually developed. Now, the investigation had something it had never possessed in 1979, a genetic signature, a biological fingerprint, not a theory, not a suspicion, something that could be compared. Investigators went back to the people who had been considered suspects in the original inquiry: Scott Walsh, Robert McGrail, Ronald Sakatsi, Victor Sakatsi, Scott Hopkins. 3 of the men voluntarily or otherwise provided samples that excluded them from the newly developed profile. McGrail also provided a sample, and his DNA did not match. The circle was narrowing. But every elimination created another question. If 4 men could be excluded, what happened with the 5th? Scott Hopkins had refused to voluntarily provide his DNA. At that stage, the investigators faced a problem. The old case had produced an investigative lead, but they still needed a confirmed sample. Then detectives obtained DNA from a plastic drinking cup that Hopkins had discarded. The laboratory could not exclude him from the male DNA profile developed from the crime scene evidence. That result was enough for investigators to seek a warrant for a direct DNA sample. In December 2011, a search warrant was obtained. The direct sample was tested. The result was no longer an uncertain lead. Hopkins's DNA matched the profile recovered from the semen found on the nightgown and bathrobe belt. For investigators, the decades-old case had suddenly become tangible. They had a person. They had a genetic connection. And they had evidence recovered from objects directly associated with Janet's body. But a match was only the beginning. Investigators still had to reconstruct the night. In 1979, Hopkins had already been interviewed. He had admitted that he and Janet had been sexually involved. He told police that he had visited her apartment before, and that their last encounter had been roughly 3 or 4 weeks before her death. He insisted he had not been with her on the night she was killed. More importantly, he had an alibi According to the account later examined by the federal court, Hopkins said that two friends, Larry and Georgina Musgraves, had spent the night at his home along with his girlfriend, Diane St. George. The men had been preparing for a pig roast. Larry Musgraves said he was with Hopkins until around 1 a.m. and woke around 5:30 a.m. with Hopkins. When investigators revisited the alibi in 2012, Musgraves again said the two couples had slept in separate rooms. He believed it would have been difficult for Hopkins to leave without being noticed, although he acknowledged it was not impossible. That detail became more important as the years went on. The case was not as simple as finding a DNA match and asking no other questions. Investigators were now looking at two conflicting narratives. One narrative said Hopkins was physically connected to evidence surrounding Janet's body. The other said he had been at home during the crucial hours. The 2012 criminal complaint emphasized Hopkins' sexual relationship with Janet and the DNA recovered from her clothing and restraint. But the probable cause affidavit did not include the other suspects and did not include Hopkins' purported alibi. The legal system would later scrutinize not only what evidence existed, but what investigators had included when seeking to charge him. On January 28, 2012, the investigation crossed a line from cold case to criminal prosecution. DeMaialo filed a homicide complaint against Hopkins. More than 32 years had passed since Janet was killed. The arrest was dramatic because the suspect was no longer a mysterious figure from an old file. He was a living man with a public identity. Hopkins was a Bridgewater Borough councilman. He was 65 years old at the time of his arrest. The photographs of him being led into court in handcuffs seemed to announce the end of a decades-old mystery. The case had finally produced an accused killer. Hopkins did not confess. He denied killing Janet. His defense maintained that he had not been with her on the night of the murder. The biological material, the defense argued, could be explained by the relationship Hopkins and Janet had acknowledged. That argument would become central to the case. The existence of Hopkins' semen on Janet's clothing and on the bathrobe belt was not itself disputed in the same way the timing was disputed. The real question became whether investigators could determine when that biological material had been deposited. If it had been deposited during an earlier consensual sexual encounter, its presence would establish a prior relationship, not necessarily a murder. If it had been deposited during the fatal encounter, the meaning would be completely different. The entire prosecution would depend on the distinction between those two possibilities. At trial in 2013, the state presented forensic evidence designed to make that distinction. Dr. Cyril Wecht, a well-known forensic pathologist, testified about the distribution of Hopkins' semen at the crime scene. His analysis attempted to connect the location of the deposits with the timing of their placement. To prosecutors, the evidence helped tell a coherent story. To the defense, the theory was scientifically unsound. The jury ultimately accepted the prosecution's interpretation and convicted Hopkins of third-degree murder. The verdict transformed the case. Newspapers described the cold case as solved. The family had finally seen a jury pronounce a man guilty. The defendant was sentenced to 8 to 16 years in prison. But the scientific dispute had not gone away. It was waiting in the appellate record. Years later, the Pennsylvania Superior Court examined the expert testimony in detail. The court focused on whether Wecht's method for determining the age of the semen deposits was scientifically reliable. The answer was critical. The court concluded that the methodology was not generally accepted and should not have been admitted under Pennsylvania's Fry standard. The issue was not whether Hopkins' DNA was physically present. It was whether the expert had a scientifically valid basis for telling the jury when that DNA had been deposited. Without that testimony, the prosecution had no other evidence purporting to establish the timing of the deposits. And because Hopkins had a prior sexual relationship with Janet, the timing mattered enormously. The appellate ruling cut through the confidence surrounding the original conviction. The court held that Hopkins' trial lawyer had been ineffective for failing to challenge Wecht's testimony properly. The conviction was overturned. The case that had appeared finished suddenly reopened. Hopkins, who had spent years in prison, was released in 2020 after the Commonwealth chose not to retry him. The legal system had delivered one verdict and then erased its own finality. The result was extraordinarily unusual. A jury had said guilty. An appellate court later determined that critical scientific testimony should never have reached that jury. The state declined to conduct another trial. Hopkins walked out of prison. Janet Walsh remained dead. And then the story entered yet another courtroom. Hopkins filed a federal civil lawsuit against members of the investigative team, arguing that his constitutional rights had been violated. He alleged malicious prosecution, fabrication of evidence, and a conspiracy to deprive him of his rights. The accusations were serious. They raised a different question from the murder trial. The issue was no longer simply whether Hopkins had killed Janet. Now the courts had to consider whether investigators had acted unlawfully in bringing the case against him. One of those defendants, former Detective Andrew Gall, later reached a settlement with Hopkins, and the claims against Gall were dismissed. The remaining defendants, Rocco DiMaialo and Ashley Mangan, sought summary judgment. Hopkins opposed them, and also asked the court to rule that there had been no probable cause to arrest him. On April 22, 2026, the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Pennsylvania issued its ruling. The court granted the remaining defendants' motions for summary judgment and denied Hopkins' motion. It did not restore the criminal conviction. It did not declare Hopkins guilty of Janet's murder. Instead, it found that Hopkins had failed to establish the necessary elements of his federal civil rights claims. The court concluded that the record did not support his allegations of malicious prosecution, fabrication of evidence, or conspiracy in the manner required for those claims to proceed to trial. The ruling contained another important distinction. The judge noted that the 2020 appellate decision concerning the reliability of Weck's testimony did not mean that the police lacked probable cause when they arrested Hopkins in 2012. The scientific testimony used at trial was not part of the probable cause affidavit that initiated the criminal case. The affidavit instead relied on Hopkins' known relationship with Janet, the discovery of male DNA on the nightgown and bathrobe belt, and the laboratory match to Hopkins. The federal court therefore separated the question of whether conviction was legally sustainable from the question of whether investigators had enough information to seek an arrest warrant. Those are not the same question. That distinction may be one of the most important facts in the entire case. A conviction requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Probable cause requires something far less. The appellate court that overturned Hopkins' conviction was addressing the fairness and reliability of the trial evidence. The federal court in 2026 was examining whether investigators had acted with sufficient legal basis when they initiated the prosecution. Different standards, different questions, different records. One could therefore exist without automatically deciding the other. The result is a case where multiple courts have reached different conclusions about different stages of the same investigation. The conviction did not survive. The civil rights claims also did not survive summary judgment. Between those decisions sits the unanswered murder itself. The 2026 ruling also highlighted something else buried inside the investigative record. In 1979, there were not one or two suspects, but 5. Each represented a different path the police had to examine. Scott Walsh was Janet's estranged husband. Robert McGrail had met her at the nightclub on the final night of her life, and may have been among the last people to see her alive. Ronald Sacazzi was her employer and had a prior sexual history with her. Victor Sacazzi had expressed an interest in Janet and lived only blocks from her apartment. Hopkins had also been sexually involved with Janet. The investigation could not originally distinguish among them. There was no decisive physical evidence. That is why the case went cold. Some of those old investigative details remain unsettling. McGrail's checkbook was found about a week and a half after murder, only a block from Janet's apartment, and police concluded it was unlikely he had simply lost it on the night she died. A 1979 polygraph examination also showed what the records described as deceptive responses from McGrail about his involvement. Scott Walsh underwent a polygraph as well, with the record describing deception concerning questions related to the murder. But none of those details became a criminal conviction. The federal court specifically warned that its summary of alternative suspects should not be interpreted as evidence that any of them committed wrongdoing. They remained investigative possibilities from a historical investigation, not proven killers. That warning matters because cold cases often generate legends. Old suspicions become repeated as facts. A polygraph becomes proof. A strange object becomes evidence. A rumor becomes an accusation. Janet's case demonstrates why that transformation is dangerous. Investigators had reasons to examine multiple people, but reasons to investigate are not the same as proof of guilt. In the end, the only person ever convicted was Hopkins, and that conviction was later overturned. No alternative suspect has been judicially established as Janet's killer. So the story reaches a strange place. The evidence did not vanish. The DNA did not vanish. The old suspect list did not vanish. The murder itself certainly did not vanish. What disappeared with certainty? The conviction that once seemed to settle the case could not withstand appellate review. The state chose not to retry. Hopkins remained free. In 2026, a federal judge again examined the history and rejected his civil claims against the remaining defendants. The judge did not solve the murder. The court did something much narrower. It ruled on whether Hopkins had proved constitutional violations by the investigators. It concluded that he had not. And that leaves Janet Walsh standing at the center of a mystery that has outlived almost everyone who first investigated it. The morning of September 1st, 1979, began with a missing woman who did not arrive at work. It ended with a murder scene. The years that followed produced suspects. Then silence. Then science. Then an arrest. Then a conviction. Then an appeal. Then freedom. Then another lawsuit. And finally, in April 2026, another federal judgment. Yet through all of those transformations, one fact never changed. Janet Walsh was murdered. The legal record can tell us what investigators believed. It can tell us what evidence was found. It can tell us why a jury once convicted. It can tell us why an appellate court later rejected the conviction. It can tell us why the state did not retry the case. But it cannot manufacture certainty where the courts no longer recognize a final conviction. That is why Janet Walsh's name continues to echo through the records. Not because the case has been forgotten, because it was never completely finished. A woman died. A family waited. Investigators searched. Science found a clue. A jury delivered a verdict. An appellate court pulled that verdict apart. And decades later, the courts were still examining the consequences. The apartment is no longer an active crime scene. The photographs are old. The evidence bags belong to another generation. But the question remains: who killed Janet Walsh? More than 40 years later, the answer is still trapped somewhere between evidence and interpretation, between memory and law, between what investigators believed and what a court can finally prove. And that may be the most haunting legacy of all. A cold case does not always end with a name. Sometimes it ends with a question. And Janet Walsh's question is still waiting. But the legal history of Janet Walsh does not end with the overturning of Gregory Scott Hopkins' conviction. The deeper story is what happened to the evidence after the verdict disappeared. DNA had once seemed to transform the investigation. It had taken a case that had remained dormant for roughly 3 decades and pushed it back into the center of the criminal justice system. Yet by the time the courts finished examining the case, the DNA could no longer carry the same meaning it had carried before the jury. The genetic match remained a fact. What changed was the interpretation placed upon it. That difference is what makes this case so difficult to reduce to a single headline. The evidence was real. The investigation was real. The conviction was real. The reversal was real. And Janet's murder remained real. What disappeared was a legal certainty that had briefly surrounded the name Gregory Scott Hopkins. The appellate ruling in 2020 exposed a central weakness. The prosecution had relied on the testimony of forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht to explain the significance of the semen deposits recovered from Janet's clothing and the bathrobe belt. The theory depended on their location and supposed age. But the Pennsylvania Superior Court concluded that the method used to establish that timing was not generally accepted in the relevant scientific community. The court found that this testimony should not have been admitted under Pennsylvania's Fry standard. That was not a minor evidentiary correction. It struck at a central component of the state's theory. Without Weck's testimony, prosecutors lacked another method to establish that Hopkins's DNA had been deposited at the time of the murder rather than during the earlier consensual sexual relationship acknowledged by both the investigation and the defense. For listeners following the case as a conventional true crime story, this is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable. A DNA match feels definitive because DNA is associated with certainty, but a DNA profile answers one question far more directly than it answers another. It can identify the source of biological material. It does not necessarily identify the circumstances in which that material arrived at a scene. In Janet's case, the existence of Hopkins's biological material was not the entire dispute. The timing was. If the material had been deposited weeks before Janet's death, it could be explained to the relationship the two had already admitted. If it had been deposited during the murder, the implications would be entirely different. The prosecution needed a scientifically reliable bridge between those possibilities. The appellate court concluded that the bridge had not been built with a sufficiently reliable method. That distinction also explains why the 2020 decision did not function as a declaration that Hopkins had been scientifically excluded from the crime. The court did not erase the DNA. It did not find that Hopkins's genetic material was somehow unrelated to Janet. Instead, it held that the state's expert had gone too far in explaining what that evidence proved. The conviction, therefore, could not survive. It was an evidentiary failure, not a magical disappearance of the underlying laboratory results. That is why the case remains so difficult to summarize. Saying DNA solved the murder is incomplete. Saying DNA proved nothing is equally misleading. The record sits between those extremes. The Commonwealth then faced an extraordinary decision. It could try the case again without the disputed testimony, or it could walk away. According to the federal court's 2026 description of the case, prosecutors chose not to retry Hopkins. He had already spent approximately 8 years in prison. The state's decision meant there would be no second jury to reconsider the evidence under a corrected set of rules. There would be no new verdict that could either reaffirm the original conviction or clear Hopkins in a second trial. The criminal case simply stopped. For Janet's family, that must have created a strange kind of silence. The original investigation had lasted for decades without an arrest. Then an arrest finally came. The accused man was convicted. For a brief period, the family had something resembling finality. The name of the man responsible seemed settled. Then the conviction was overturned, and the retrial never happened. The family was left with the memory of a verdict that was no longer legally enforceable. The murder had an accused person. It had once had a convicted person. But it did not have a conviction that remained in force. That distinction may sound procedural from a distance. For relatives, it is anything but procedural. It changes the story they have been telling themselves about what justice accomplished. And yet, Hopkins did not simply disappear from a case. After his release, he launched a civil lawsuit against investigators. The lawsuit alleged that police had violated his constitutional rights through malicious prosecution, fabrication of evidence, and conspiracy. Those allegations reopened the details of the old investigation from another direction. Instead of asking whether Hopkins was guilty, the federal court was asked whether the investigators had acted unlawfully in developing and presenting the case against him. The distinction became crucial. The criminal prosecution and the civil rights lawsuit involved different burdens, different legal standards, and different questions. A court could conclude that a conviction was overturned because of improper evidence, while separately concluding that investigators had not committed the constitutional violations Hopkins alleged. And that is largely what happened. The most recent major ruling came on April 22, 2026, when Judge A. Nicholas Runjon of the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Pennsylvania issued an opinion granting summary judgment to the remaining defendants Rocco DiMaialo and Ashley Mangan. Andrew Gall, another defendant, had previously reached a settlement with Hopkins, and the claims against Gall were dismissed. The court rejected Hopkins's remaining federal claims. The ruling did not restore the criminal conviction. It also did not declare Hopkins a killer. It addressed whether Hopkins had established the elements necessary for his civil rights claims. The court concluded that he had not. That ruling contained a remarkable observation about the original arrest. The court distinguished between the flaws that ultimately destroyed the conviction and the information investigators possessed when they sought a warrant. The 2020 appellate ruling centered on the scientific reliability of Weck's trial testimony, but that testimony was not the basis of the original probable cause affidavit used to obtain Hopkins's arrest warrant. The affidavit relied on the investigation's discovery of male DNA on evidence from the crime scene and its subsequent match to Hopkins. The court therefore concluded that the later invalidation of Weck's testimony did not automatically erase probable cause at the time of the arrest. For a journalist, that distinction is essential. The words "conviction overturned" can easily be interpreted by an audience as police had no evidence. The record does not support that simplification. Investigators had evidence. They had a DNA match. They had a prior relationship between Hopkins and Janet. They had an investigation that had been reopened after decades. What the courts eventually rejected was a particular scientific interpretation used to establish the timing and significance of that DNA. The federal court's 2026 decision then found that this did not, by itself, establish the constitutional violations Hopkins alleged. The legal system was not saying that investigators had fabricated the existence of the DNA. It was saying that different legal questions required different analyses. And then there is the original crime scene itself. Janet was found in her apartment in Monica, Pennsylvania, after spending the previous night at the Getaway Lounge with friends. She had danced with Robert McGrail and later went with him and a friend to Perkins' restaurant. She eventually returned home. The following morning, she was discovered dead. The physical circumstances were grim. Her hands had been restrained behind her back using a bathrobe belt or tie, and a bandana was associated with the strangulation. She was found on her bed. The case immediately raised questions about access. There was no obvious indication that an unknown intruder had smashed his way into the apartment. Investigators therefore focused heavily on people who knew Janet or had interacted with her. 5 suspects entered the original investigative picture. That number became important decades later because it demonstrated how little certainty investigators actually possessed in 1979. They had several people to examine, but no technology capable of decisively separating them. The case went cold. Years later, when modern DNA testing was applied, the scientific process began eliminating some of the old possibilities. That is one reason the case appeared so promising after its reopening. The genetic evidence did not initially produce one name out of nowhere. It helped narrow a historical suspect list. But narrowing a list is not the same thing as proving a murder. That distinction became visible only after the case reached appellate review. The old evidence also reveals how easily a case can be transformed by technology. Investigators in 1979 had conducted a physical examination that failed to locate the biological evidence later discovered. Decades afterward, an alternate light source exposed traces on Janet's nightgown, the bathrobe belt, and the bedsheet. That technological change was extraordinary. The evidence had not suddenly appeared. It had been present from the beginning. Science had simply developed the ability to detect it. The case, therefore, offers a dramatic demonstration of how old evidence can suddenly become valuable when a new forensic technique becomes available. But technology can also introduce a new danger. Once investigators discover a piece of evidence that appears decisive, there's a temptation to build the entire narrative around it. In Janet's case, the DNA match became the central organizing fact of the reopened investigation. The question then became how to explain it. The prosecution ultimately relied on expert analysis that linked the distribution of the semen to the murder. When the court later rejected that scientific methodology, a major part of the narrative collapsed with it. The case demonstrates how an investigation can move from uncertainty to apparent certainty very quickly, and how that certainty can later prove fragile. There is also a deeply human consequence to that process. Janet cannot participate in the debate. Her family cannot alter the evidence. The investigators cannot return to September 1979. The jury cannot travel backward in time and observe the scene themselves. Everyone is working from fragments, statements, memories, clothing, photographs, laboratory results, expert interpretations, court records. The farther the case moves from the original moment, the more those fragments matter. But every fragment also carries limitations. A witness may remember incorrectly. A forensic method may later become outdated. A photograph may show an object but not explain its history. DNA may identify a biological source but not necessarily establish when it arrived. A legal verdict may reflect the evidence available at trial but still be overturned later. That is a terrible complexity of a decades-old homicide. In the end, Janet's case forces us to separate three ideas that are often blended together in true crime storytelling. There is investigative suspicion, there is evidentiary support, and there is legal proof. They are not interchangeable. Investigators can suspect someone without being able to charge them. Prosecutors can charge someone without being able to secure a lasting conviction. A jury can convict, and an appellate court can later reverse that conviction. A person can spend years incarcerated and eventually walk free. And a murder can remain legally unresolved even after one man has spent years in prison for it. Janet Walsh's case moved through every one of those stages. More than 40 years have passed since Janet walked into the last hours of her life. The nightclub is part of the history now. The original detectives are part of the history. The old laboratory tests are part of the history. The 2012 arrest is part of the history. The 2013 conviction is part of the history. The 2020 reversal is part of the history. And the April 2026 federal ruling is now part of that history too. Yet none of those events can change the simplest fact. Janet Walsh was 23 years old when she died. She did not receive a second chance. The justice system did. It investigated again. It prosecuted again. It reconsidered. It overturned. It declined to retry. And it continued to litigate. That is why the Janet Walsh case should not be presented as a story with a clean ending. It is a story about how truth and proof can move in different directions. It is a story about an old piece of evidence waiting decades for technology to recognize its value. It is a story about the extraordinary power of DNA and the equally important limits of what DNA alone can prove. It is a story about a conviction that once appeared to end a decades-old mystery, only for the courts to reopen the questions behind it. And perhaps the most haunting image is not Gregory Scott Hopkins in handcuffs. It is Janet Walsh's bedroom, the same room that investigators entered in 1979, the same room that held the evidence for decades, the same room that produced the DNA evidence that would eventually trigger an arrest, the same room that ultimately became the center of a scientific controversy. Everything changed around that room. The technology changed. The investigators changed. The courts changed. The suspect's legal status changed. But the room remained the silent witness. It cannot tell us what happened. It can only preserve what was left behind. And somewhere inside those surviving traces lies the difference between what investigators once believed and what the law can finally establish. For Janet's family, that difference is not academic. It is the distance between believing an answer has arrived and knowing that the answer can survive scrutiny. That distance remains. And after more than 4 decades, the question still hangs over the case. Not simply who was arrested, not simply who was convicted, not simply whose DNA was found, but who, beyond all reasonable doubt, killed Janet Walsh. The legal record has changed. The evidence has been challenged. The conviction has been overturned. The retrial never came. And the mystery, despite everything, remains alive.